Okay, here we go again. Um, so it's Tuesday afternoon, the Tuesday after Tisha B'Av, and I want to take a look at the famous Parshas Shabbos Nachamu, the famous Haftarah, which is being sponsored by a very good friend, Rabbi Yitzhak Friedman here in Baltimore. I remember when he was the mashgiach, running the kashas there for the OU, for Ed and the others. And he says he wants to sponsor the talk in memory of his aunt, whose yahrzeit is today. So this is Big Zeichel Nishmas. Sarah Bas Rabbi Yosef Moshe, Mrs. Vera Gross, who's from Hungary, and she survived the murder of the chassan under the chuppah by the Nazis in Machshmam to live a frum life and remarry. That was in 1945. I asked him. And she did, and she ended up raising two stepchildren, he told me. And more importantly, this actually affected by what the Dvar Torah want to say now, because what he described to her, I had relatives like this also. These are people who are like permanently impacted by the war. Because in other words, obviously the guy that she was originally going to get married got killed. And then she remarried after the war and so forth. And doesn't seem like she had an easy time of it. And that's totally understandable. That's the real story of Tisha B'Av. What we call today PTSD. Think about the impact of the Holocaust on so many. And again, I'm speaking here from family experience, where they survived the war, but they didn't survive the war because psychological, they got messed up one degree or another. And this is part of the sadness of the Tisha B'Av or any tragedy. Let me put it this way: you think the people who survived by Kochba or the people who survived the Churban Beis Hamikdash were normal? You don't think they were traumatized for the rest of their lives, especially those who were, let's say, for example, and there were thousands like this, captured by the Romans, sold as slaves, lived a horrible life. And I'm just talking about one who eventually got ransomed by fellow Jews, because that happened to some degree. And so imagine if you were there in Yerushalayim or something like that at the Churban, which is its own horror, and then you have to go through the Roman stuff, which is its own horror, and you end up as an Eved Avodas Perach in Egypt, the way Josephus describes it, for example, which is another horror. And then after a couple of years, let's say for argument's sake, then you got Pidyon Shvuyim, and now you go and like, who are you? What are you? You don't just pick up and Humpty, here we go, zippity doodah. You had horrible experiences, and they didn't have shrinks in those days. I don't know if a shrink could even handle that, but they didn't have shrinks and people to help you psychologically and so forth. So what do? As I said before, my mother, for example, had a sister who survived Auschwitz. She did, but she never married after the war. She lived by herself in Pressburg and Bratislava until she died in the 60s, for 20 some years after the war. And my mother's non-Jewish friends, who were very righteous people, helped her and cared for her all during the 20 some years, from let's say 45 to 68. I think, if I remember correctly, she passed away in 68. But in other words, she was walking wounded, as we say, PTSD. And that's the worst of it. You understand? So it sounds like, to some degree, if I understand correctly, Sarah Bas Rabbi Yosef Moshe, whose Neshama we're paying tribute today and commemorating, was from that generation. And the reason I mentioned that influenced what I want to say today, because obviously this is the Haftarah Shabbos Nachamu, Ami, be comforted, my people. But it's easier said than done. And there's a very interesting Yalkut. Now, I'll tell you the truth. What I'm going to say is that it's a mish between me and Rabbi Yonasan Eivshitz. I saw something that impressed me. And but on the other hand, I'm refracting it through my own understanding and experience. I don't want to blame anything on him. But there's this wonderful collection that came out now last year, I guess, which is called Zachas V'Nechamas Yonasan, which basically they did a good collection of all the writings of Yonasan Eivshitz. I'm a big fan of his, as you know, on the Parsha of Torah, Yaris Tavash, and all the rest of it. Stuff having to do with Tisha B'Av and post Tisha B'Av, including Shabbos Nachamu, the Shiva, the Nechemta, the Geul in the future, etc., etc., etc. I don't get any money out of this book, but if you're into Yonasan Eivshitz, if you like that sort of thing, this book that I'm holding in my hand, for those who can see it on the YouTube, is very interesting. The truth is, when I read usually things from Yonasan Eivshitz, sometimes they grab you, and sometimes they stimulate you to think of your own. And I find that that's just my personal interaction with his writings. Now, Nachamu, Nachamu Ami is the prophet Isaiah saying, find comfort. But, first of all, it ain't simple. And second of all, there's a very powerful Yalkut Shimoni, which is originally a Psikta of Kahana, I think, in which, and I should really do a podcast just on this. Maybe I will in the future, but I'm not going to do it today because it'll take like an hour to just read the whole text. In which, if you go through the Yalkut on this pasuk of Anochi Anochim Nachemchem from today's Haftarah and Nachamu Nachamu Ami, you can see what I'm holding in front of me. It's page after page after page, in which basically God calls upon different prophets to offer comfort, and each one fails. They can't do it. In other words, Hashem says, I'm looking for somebody who can provide comfort, and it doesn't work because, for example, they say, Amos, you provide comfort. And he tries, and you quote a pasuk from Amos, but then Hashem says, because you also said so many negative things about the Jewish people. So they weren't going to take it off you. Same thing with Shea, same thing with Yoel, and all the Treyasar, and Yishayim and Cheskel. They all have such horrible things to say about the Jews, although it's also mixed up with Nechama. So the prophet Isaiah, Yeshayahu, has in the first half of the book all this negative stuff about us. I'll give you an example. Chazon Yeshaya ben Ayam, so we read last week. But now we read from chapter 40, as they call it, and Nachamu Nachamu Ami, it's a different, kind of sprach. And at the end, Klal Yisrael, to use the words here, he says, Pirish, the Isa Medrash, which means the Yalkut Shemoti, and the Yalkut is just a collection from other places, as you know. And in this case, it's from the Psikta of Kana. Shalom Rotzi Yisrael Kabul Tanchum Min Anavim, Achama Kadosh Baruch Hu Anochi Anochi Menachemchem. That when you have the pasuk in this week's Haftarah, Anochi Anochi Hu Menachemchem, I Anochi Anochi, I'm the one who gives you Nechama. That's a certain way of hinting that no one else can. Okay? V'nira Shalo says Tom Lama Lo Kibul Tanchum Min Anavim. And how come the Jewish people couldn't get Nechama from the Nevi'im until God had to do it himself? To my mind, especially I say with my family background, and Rabbi Friedman here also, it's a Friedman. To me, it's not such a big kasha. And the reason I say it is because anybody can spout Nechama. You get it? Anybody can say the right words. Oh, I'm so sorry at your loss. It's so terrible. Now things are going to be different. Blah, blah, blah. And it's important to say that, no question about it. I'm not knocking it. And how people should find people that can offer them some kind of nechama. But it don't work when you suffered so much and went through. If you saw like this lady did her halachas and killed in front of her eyes on the chuppah, if you went through Auschwitz, if you lived through the ghettos, if you went through all these different tortures and stuff like that, you can't simply say nachamu nachamu ami, It doesn't work. So to my way of understanding, this Yalkut, which is very important, is basically saying to provide real relief and real healing from undergoing a terrible time, like they did in the time of Churban Beis Hamikdash, like they did in the time of Bar Kochba, like they did in the Holocaust and in the Crusades and all this other junk. You read the kinos that we did the other day in the Crusades on Tisha B'Av, and now it should be up online, my thing. I mean, they're not. What are they saying? They're saying there's no nechama, right? They say maybe give us some revenge. That's the best you can ask for. That works in some degree. You understand? In other words, if somebody, and this is human, this is real, okay? If you, if the Rishaim perpetrated terrible things, and you see that they got wiped out or terribly punished, it's not exactly nechama, but it satisfies a part of the nechama. You saw justice was done. You saw the bad guys got what's coming to them. It's not going to bring back the loved ones. It's not going to take away the suffering that you endured, the beatings and the starvation, all the other junk you had to endure. It's something, okay? We know this right now as I speak. Because in Israel, first of all, the Chatufim who've been rescued, right, the hostages who've been rescued, I'm sure are all going through heavy shrink treatment, and they're having their nightmares and all that kind of stuff as you read. Secondly, the soldiers in the army are going through all this kind of stuff, and there's not enough shrinks in Israel to handle that. That's reading the papers, no surprise to me. And so they're going to carry around this psychological problem, which is completely understandable, completely normal. Long after this war is over, okay? And then you think of the poor people that are still stuck there that we're seeing now on the internet and the news, you see they're dressed, they're emaciated like in the concentration camps, and they're being subject to the worst torture. The Hamas are mamzerim, b'nei mamzerim, and they like to do the more cruel possible. They get kicks out of that. You understand? It's just a sadistic. They get kicks out of that. And so, how can you say, "Oh, now it's Nechama, now it's over"? Even if Israel rescued them tomorrow, which I wish, but it ain't going to happen, right? Even if Israel rescued them tomorrow, it would be a long, long healing process. Okay, me myself and I'm lucky. My parents somehow got past it. I don't think you ever totally get past it, but compared to other people I know that went through the war and other friends my age went through the war, their parents were just screwed over mentally as a result of war. It's not anybody's fault, but boy, they took it out on the kids. So I was actually lucky in that particular regard. Now, all of that is by way of background that the Medrash, therefore, the Yalkut Shimoni or the Psikta, says that Klal Yisrael says to Hashem, I don't want a nechama from the Nevi'im. I want it to for you, or that's not the right way to put it. What I hear from the prophets doesn't comfort me. Only what you say comforts me. Anochi, anochi hu menachemchem. Right? That's very powerful because what it means is like this. And this is my opinion. I'm not blaming this or this is the way I understand it, and that is that the Nevi'im have to think how to phrase this correctly, not for PC, but want to get the idea straight. Art scroll does not work. You see, simply saying you suffered because you were mechaper for your averas, or you must have done something wrong. We have a book called Job. Eov, it's all about that, and none of that stuff worked. The three friends of Eov all said, "Oh, here's the reason that this happened, or that's the reason," and be comforted by knowing the facts. All the rest of it, that was junk. And even says in the book of Eov that it wasn't good in the eyes of Hashem the way they talked. And at the end, Eov confronts God himself. And he said, "Why did you do this to me?" And God says, "I don't have to answer you, and you wouldn't understand anyway because I'm beyond you." It's not a nechama, but at least it's a true answer. Okay, true answer. Because if he says you can't understand me, then I don't want to hear any explanations. So if somebody said, "Why did 6 million people get killed?" I don't want to hear this kind of stuff. Like Victor Miller at Art Scroll, they did this wrong and all that. It doesn't work. Meaning it doesn't bring nechama. You feel good by getting it off of your chest. And you feel because you never suffered. So you were, lived after the war. You lived in America during the war and all the rest of it. So it soothes your conscience to say, I have a theological reason why all these sorts of things happen. But the people who lived in the Korban time, they don't want to hear this because of Sinas Chinam. The people who died in Bais Rishon period under being slaughtered by Nebuchadnezzar, they don't want to hear, oh, this is for the bubbling blood and Zechariah. They don't want to hear that. That doesn't help them at all. You see? And yet we're told in this Haftarah, Nachamu, Nachamu Ami, Anochi Anochi Menachemchem, that Hashem wants a nechama to be provided. Okay? So nechama to be provided requires divine intervention because no prophet is sufficiently sublime to get that message across. And that's what you see in this long psikta over here, this long Yalkut Shimoni, because a Navi is different than Moshe Rabbeinu, we're told, in that Moshe actually got the words to write down in the Chumash. This is what you call in English verbal inspiration. But the prophets of Israel don't get verbal inspiration. They're not told what to say, except on the rare occasions when they are. A few times they are. But generally speaking, Ma Torah Yirmiyahu, Makal Shoked Ani Roeh, Sir Nafuach Ani Roeh. You understand? The prophet gets a certain vision. I never experienced this, so I don't know. If you read the Derech Hashem, he tries to describe it, but all we know is it feels like you get twisted inside out, which means it's excruciatingly painful. And in the end, you have the impression is made on you, and you verbalize it. So yes, Hashem chose Yeshaya, Yirmiyah, Yechezkel, Hosea, Yoel, Amos, Avad, Yonah, Micham, and all the others, and other prophets. He chose them as the people to be the messengers, and that is true. They put it in their own words, and they refract it through their understanding. You know what I'm saying? In other words, whenever you see a nevuah in the Tanakh, you see a nevuah. Now, I'm not talking about the Chumash, not talking about Moshe Rabbeinu, but the others. It's going to be limited because it's limited to the experiences of the prophet. So even Isaiah couldn't talk about a computer, right? Hosea and Amos can't talk about automobiles. is beyond their scope of understanding. They were at their time, and they could speak about sticks and stones and trees and people and all that kind of stuff. And God, for whatever reason, chose to communicate his stuff in those centuries, way back when, 3,000 years ago and so forth, between 2 and 3,000 years ago to be a little more accurate, uh, for whatever reason. And so that's what we go with. But in the end of the day, it couldn't comprehend the totality of human understanding. Only I, Hashem, can do so. Because even if I'm talking in the time of Isaiah, I know about computers. And I know about, the internet. And I know about automobiles. I even know about Teslas. You know what I mean? Because God, by definition, is, not only knows everything, he created all the knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. And so, transferred to our topic, Nachamu Ami Yeshayahu is talking about a battered and bloody Jewish people. Okay? If you want to be literal, you can say he's talking about in the aftermath of the invasion of Sancherib. If you want to be a little less literal, he can foresee the Churban Bayis Rishon, maybe Churban Bayis Sheni. If you want to be less literal, more expansive, he's talking about the Jewish experience of suffering throughout the history. Rabbi Friedman told me to talk about Jewish chosenness maybe another time, but part of the Jewish chosenness is chosen for suffering. That's not all it is, right? It's not all it is. But chosen means you suffer. Now, we say you suffer because you go off the derech. I get that, and I understand that theologically, but now you're talking like a human being. Now you're talking like art school. To justify the ways of the Lord to man, like John Milton says. But if you're talking about a person who suffered, ain't going to do anything. Someone who saw their children shechted before their eyes or things like this, and say, well, that's the price that has to be paid for X, Y, and Z. Dabra Alev Yerushalayim, that's not speaking Alev. That's speaking Al Moach, perhaps, maybe. Dabra Alev Yerushalayim, you want to speak to the Lev, which is the inner kishkes of the person, the inner sanctum of a person's consciousness, the Kodesh Kodashim of their identity. That's deep. As I've said many times, the human personality is infinite. Knowledge is infinite. Right? The soul is infinite. I just made 3 big statements over there. I don't know if you noticed that. You think it through, you'll see. The human personality is infinite. And when people suffer the way they suffered, because they're terrible suffering, it requires divine to provide some kind of nechama. So all the Nevi'im Yisrael, who were great people, right? Great people, the greatest. They couldn't do it. They couldn't do it. And it's a gift from God if a person is able to find the nechama. So if you find me, somebody went through the war, the Holocaust, as many of my family did and others, and somehow or other they were able to get past that and rebuild, that's a gift from God. And even then, I don't believe any of them totally got past it, and they had nightmares and all this other stuff. But if you show me somebody who, and I'm sure there are some, who went through Auschwitz and Dachau and all the other business, and all that, and somehow or other, I don't know how, put it past them, and were happy later in their lives, and, just closed that down or something like that, and moved on without being wounded by it. That's just, they have some schus up or something. That's a divine gift. You understand? That's something special. Otherwise, l'ratzu l'kabel tanchumin and neviim, because neviim couldn't speak the language, because neviim didn't experience this kind of suffering themselves. You hear what I just said? The Navis that you find in the Tanakh were not people who went through all this themselves. Even Yirmiyahu was spared the worst. He lives a charmed life as part almost of his curse. I won't say it's a curse, but Hashem says, I'm going to protect you against all misfortune, but you have to klima baruk. You have to say unpopular things and be spit upon and all that kind of stuff. So Yirmiyahu, for example, during the famine that precedes the first Beis Hamikdash fall, because he's in a jail cell, looking out the window. That's how he writes Eicha. You can see in the street people dropping dead from starvation. It's like Tovim Hayu Chale Cher Mechalale Rov. And he sees other things like the children dying at the mother's breast and so forth. He sees that, but he personally was in a jail, and a jail in those days, as I've said 100 times, was a political thing. Jail was not a place like nowadays where people are put in jail as the punishment. That didn't start to the late 18th, early 19th century. And how successful that is. But
Jail instead was a place where it wasn't punished, but you kept someone there until the trial, maybe. And more importantly, it was for political prisoners. Like it says about Yosef, Makom Asher Asireh Hamelech Asurim. Yirmiyahu fits that category exactly. The nobles of Judah wanted to kill him because he was telling the truth against them and exposing them. They tried to kill him. And the king, Sidkiyahu, to protect him, put him in what we call today protective custody. Put him in a jail cell, and there was a guy, Obed Edom Agiti, who helped him, if you read this story. And Obed Edom Akushi, I'm sorry. Evid Melch Hakushi, that's his name. It was a black guy who saved his life. Evid Melch Hakushi. So that means like this. As far as we can tell, Yirmiyahu had 3 meals a day. Unlike everybody else in Israel who was starving, because he was in a politically VIP prison cell reserved for the king's prisoners. The king had what to eat. The people didn't have what to eat. It's always like that. So Yirmiyahu was spared, this is divine providence, that he personally shouldn't suffer the pangs of starvation. But he watched them, you see? He watched them. So my point is, you can describe, as he does in Eicha, but you didn't feel it yourself. So as far as I'm aware, now maybe somebody will correct me, if I grew through the different Nevi'im, I can't think offhand of any of them that were Holocaust survivors themselves, that they went through the terrible times. Maybe I'm wrong, but as far as I can tell, it's like that. So therefore, I don't know a Navi whose family was shechted in front of his eyes, whose children were eaten in front of his eyes, that sort of thing. So how do you offer Nechama to somebody? Right? Through glib phrases, through poetry, through piyutim, through singing, Hasidic style. That don't work. You understand? And therefore, the prophet Yeshayahu, who's the greatest of the prophets, and if you read this passage in the Yalkut, you'll see that God said, you're different, and, you offer Nechama, but Yeshayahu also offered his bitter words. As I said before, Shabbos Chazon and many other places, the first day of the book is pretty negative, pretty harsh, because that's before the Churban happened. So, even Yeshayahu says, Nachamu, Nachamu Ami. The way I understand this is, it ain't working. Why does he double the lashon? Nachamu, Nachamu. Why does he just say Nachamu Ami? Because he sees, and this is very human. Nachamu Ami. No response. Wait a minute. Dabra Levi Shalaim B'Kirei Leha, and I'm going to cure them, and I'm going to bring all this sort of thing, all the good stuff they have in the Haftarah. What are the Lashonis that we know in the Haftarah today? It's all very famous. Isaiah 50. And my rusty, trusty Tanakh here. I should remember this. Here we go. Here we go. Altiri Toles Yaakov. 1 second here. Sorry about this. Here we go. You suffered so much. But now, Panu Derech B'Hashem, Yashub Arava Mesil Ahinu, now is going to be a road back to Yerushalayim in Mashiach time, and V'nigla Kvod Hashem Rochel B'Asiyah Kivi Hashem Diber, right? And Mevazeres Sion, the herald that says Harimi Al Tiroi Imli Ari Yehuda Hine Elohechem. Okay, that doesn't help the people. That doesn't give them the chama, right? Because, and this Yonasan Ancient says, put somebody through a terrible time and then say, at the end it'll be okay. Or the way he describes it, suffer for your throughout your early and middle years, and in your senior citizens years, everything will be great. Nobody wants that. Right? So suffer, and then you'll get, it's not a nachama. Therefore, he tries, nachamu, which means like this. What's wrong with you? Why don't you be comforted? No? I'm telling you, harimi v'kol reich, bevaseret sion, mashmiya Yeshua, all this business. They don't want to hear it. So you tell somebody who survived the Holocaust, you say, well, you made it. and or the Crusades or anything like that. You made it, you survived, and now when everything's gonna be great, it's not so great. Only, as I say, the master of the universe can decide as a matter of grace to provide the chama, because God controls the mental as well. So all right, then you're just lucky. I don't know how many people were lucky, right? So that Yalkut and this an Avshitz and all this is speaking real. So yes, we're going to all hear drashas about the Shabbos Nachamu and the Nechama and all the rest of it. And the truth of the matter is, the Jewish people do need to hear Nechama, because we hear negative all the time. It wears you down. Even now, nobody wants to read the news these days. It's so depressing. You need to hear a picker upper. But the real Nechama, to make you minachem, to find comfort where formerly you had pain and anguish, that, anochi minachemchem, only Hashem can do that, and not any rabbi, not any sefer, and not any video, and not any recording or podcast, especially if it's self-righteous. So, Seimshitz is saying, and Ayaka this, when you do try nechama, the number one stumbling block is the self-righteousness, you understand, the theology, because that makes the admonisher feel good about himself or herself, but it doesn't make the victim feel good. And the whole point of Nechama is make the victim feel good, even though people usually are concentrating that I should feel good. And Nachamu, what's wrong with you? Aren't I eloquent enough? And am I not, saying, true things? And it's a Chazal, and it's a Gemara, and it's a Chumash, and this rest, and the guy doesn't want to hear it. He does not want to hear it. Anyway, that is how I would understand it, and I suspect, I did not know her, that the Nifteris Mizavir Gross probably felt something along those lines. Like I say, I did not know her. So the people who went through the suffering then, it required a nachamu. It required no nachamu nachami. Anochi menachemchem. It required Hashem Himself in His way, which is the only possible way to provide this kind of psychological relief. Oh yeah, the Jewish people now in Israel and around the world, but especially in Israel, need this sort of thing. They should be zocha to get anochi menachemchem. Thank you again to Rabbi Friedman, and we pay tribute to her memory of Mrs. Gross.